well, what does that actually mean? If someone's accountable for it, do they get that? Do they agree to it? Do they understand what it means in the same way you understand what it means?
The question is from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Paul from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Ricky from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Rob from Thinking Focus.
And the question is, how do leaders create and destroy accountability? One of the most frequent questions we get asked when training or coaching managers and leaders is what do leaders actually have to do? You know, is there something like a job description? People just want to know that they're doing the right things. So we researched this, and there are lots of different opinions about parts of the leader's role, but nothing that brought all of the aspects together in a way that succinctly answered the question. So we've built our own model, bringing together a load of disparate ideas from lots of different thought leaders on leadership. The model breaks down the role of a leader into three key areas: purpose, people, and productivity. And with each of these areas, we've broken them down into a further 3 steps. In this podcast, we're going to focus on productivity, and in particular, the role of a leader in ensuring accountability. So, Ricky, Rob, how do leaders create and destroy accountability?
Remind me, Paul, how long have we got? So, taking ownership has got to be a key element to this, hasn't it? Ownership of the deliverables and making sure, as a leader, that people can take ownership and do take ownership of the things that we need as outputs, as deliverables.
I think definitely that. I think we also need to make sure that everything, as an owner, particularly if we care about it, particularly if we are measured on it, we need to make sure that everything is owned.
Okay.
So can I just ask you two a question then? Define what you mean by ownership.
Well, for me, ownership is about who's ultimately going to take the fall for this when it doesn't happen. And that could be the credit for when it does, of course. So let's not see this see both sides of the same coin, as it were. But for me, who's ultimately going to take the heat when it doesn't work?
So it comes back to that accountable word then, yeah? So if that is what ownership is about, who's accountable, or are there degrees of ownership? Is that what you're getting at in your question, Paul?
Well, I think one of the reasons I asked the question is, and you guys will have experienced this, when we're working with people, particularly if you use like a model like RACI. So, and I know we've had this debate in the past that it's actually the wrong way around. It should be RC. So it should be accountable, responsible, informed and consulted. But I think people get really confused between accountability and responsibility.
Well, you've just turned it into ARIC for a start.
ARIC, absolutely. So
that's another right. Yeah.
Consulted and informed.
Yeah, well, me and words. What can I say? But you get the principle that actually, am I responsible for this? Am I accountable for this? Is that the same thing? I'm the owner either way, surely.
And there's, because there's a level of ownership in both of those things, isn't there?
There is, yeah.
Well, I think for me, it's kind of going, who has ultimate accountability for this? That doesn't necessarily mean they're the ones doing the work, by the way. So it could be, like in our organisation, I have accountability for certain things, but I'm not responsible for doing all the work, all the tasks. In fact, it's a good job because I probably can't do most of them. And that's where you come in, Paul. But the reality is, my job is to make sure it gets done.
Right.
I also will help others in terms of what they need in order to do their deliverables. So I might need to help clear out some obstacles. I might need to help build some bridges with certain parts of the organization. I might need to make resources available for them if I want to deliver against the thing I'm accountable for. But I might not be doing the job or the jobs.
Let me get this clear then. So I'm just going to summarize what I think you've just said. Accountability is I'm the ultimate owner of this thing. If it goes wrong, it's on my head. It's my butt that gets kicked, for want of a better word.
Yes.
Responsible, I'm doing the work.
Yes.
Very often those two things go hand in hand because I own it, I'm accountable and responsible for it, but they don't have to be.
No.
And when you think about big organizations, they can't be because, if you've got somebody who sits on the executive team, they're not going to have the time to do all the work. They've got other responsibilities, but they might take the accountability at board level or exec level for that particular part of the organization, that particular project, or that particular activity that we've signed up to do.
And so here what we're saying is the leader has a responsibility in driving that accountability through the organization.
Yes.
Yes, and he does that by, they work through a series of tasks, activities, tactics in order to execute. And individuals within the organization will take accountability for those actions, those activities. So they'll be responsible for doing the tasks that collectively add up to the thing that I am taking accountability for.
So that means, for clarity, that two other elements that are very important need to be brought into this, that decisions are made, the right decisions, hopefully at the right time. So part of accountability is making sure that the decisions are made about things being done, when they're going to be done, in what order, to what level, what are the measurables. And also part of accountability must be to create the environment and the process behind that decision making.
Right. So almost you're saying here that the leader is the person who not only makes sure that we're making decisions, but also makes sure that we know how to make decisions, that we have process and structure and an approach to decision making.
Yes.
I would add one further thing to that, in that our goal as a leader in this space is to remove all ambiguity in terms of who is accountable, and making sure that everybody knows who's responsible for doing what. Because the worst thing in the world, and I've sat on projects, and I'm sure you both have too, where you sit there and the assumption's been made that so-and-so's got it, and they go, I didn't realise I got that. I've not done it. I didn't realise I was responsible for making that happen.
And that goes to that old adage, isn't it? About, you can help people take accountability, but you can't give it to them because they might not know you've given it to them. They might not accept it. They might not want it. And
it might have happened by default just because somebody else didn't put their name forward or didn't come forward. Everyone then just made an assumption that other people were doing it.
The other element is that, how many assumptions do we make? Because I am the new person, the new leader in charge of, say, I don't know, the operational team. And the organization understand that my accountabilities are X, Y, and Z, but I think my accountabilities are A, B, and C. So nobody sat me down, and I'm working to a different set of expectations and a different set of outcomes. I'm taking accountability, but we have a misalignment in terms of who's taking accountability of what.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair statement, that people misunderstand what other people are accountable for. The other example of that I would give is a number of times people have said in a meeting, "Oh, so and so's doing that," and you go, "They're not in the room."
Does so and so know?
Yes. Has anybody agreed with them? Do they have the same view of the timescales? Do they think they're actually accountable for it? So it's a whole ball game here of kind of managing. Well, what does that actually mean? If someone's accountable for it, do they get that? Do they agree to it? Do they understand what it means in the same way you understand what it means?
Which comes back to my kind of guiding principle in these things is remove all ambiguity. There are no question marks here. There are no unanswered questions. There are no assumptions. And if there are, they're documented and we test them and we go and find out the answer to that assumption to make sure that everybody understands how this domino chain holds together. And if somebody doesn't do their bit, the domino chain, when it falls, stops and doesn't continue to the end point.
Okay, so if I'm the leader in this scenario, and by leader I could be manager, I could be, virtual leader, what's my responsibility? What is it I need to do to make this work?
As we've already discussed, there's quite a few things that are organised in all of this. So it's sort of almost like, I don't know if culture is too big a word, but setting out the environment, the structure, the framework that everything can work in the way that it's intended to work to get to the deliverables. So leaders, perhaps then, the role of the leader should be to set that framework up and make sure, to Ricky's point, that ambiguity doesn't exist and that the environment in which people can operate is conducive to making the culture the right culture, a culture of ownership and responsibility, so that people can make decisions and they're very clear about how to make those decisions, and they're involved in those decisions, and that people are held to account.
I think I agree with those, Rob. I think the other thing is this kind of always comes back to a connection with purpose. So we're not just telling you what you're responsible for. We're also telling you why. We're telling you why this matters, why this is important, how that links to the bigger picture. So inevitably it will bleed into purpose, which we talk a lot in a number of our other podcasts. Mm-hmm. But, we need to understand what makes this so important and how that has an impact on other things. And we've got to make sure that people are held to account. We've got to help them to deal with those issues, because if we leave them, they'll try their best. But actually, ultimately, I'm accountable for this. So I need to make sure that you've got everything you need in order to do the job that we need you to do.
So I think it's interesting in there about that seems to indicate that we're deciding how things are actually organised. It's not just the what of the organised, it's the, how are we going to organise things? I like the word scope here, because part of the role of a leader should be almost a complete description and communication and understanding about what's in scope here and what's not in scope. What does it actually mean for us to be able to do these elements of it? And because we're concentrating on those elements, by default, we're not concentrating on these other elements. This is in scope, that's not. So we define very clear responsibilities, and people accept those responsibilities, and we make it easy for them to accept those responsibilities because they know them, they understand them, so they're quite happy to step up and play to their strengths. But we're also talking about reporting and measurement structures here. We're being organised. That's part of the productivity piece.
So in the original question, we talked about create and destroy, and we haven't really talked about destroy. So let's do a bit of destruction. So how do leaders screw this up? What is it that people do that gets this completely wrong?
Well, I think for me, you kind of start with accountability will go wrong when there's shades of grey, when we're not clear who's got which bit. Where does my responsibility or accountability end, and where does yours begin? Who's responsible for which bits? If we leave it, that shade of grey, then inevitably things will get missed, things will get dropped, and those dreaded assumptions will take over, and we'll just miss the end game that we're trying to deliver.
And we see that a lot, don't we, in the work that we all get involved with. So this is the sort of the silo mentality. This is the handover between departments, or the lack of it. It's where sort of areas where things might have changed, but nobody's acknowledged those changes, or things are not known. So one department's working to a particular way of doing things or a particular agenda, and that's just not congruent with another. And yet both departments need to be joined up in order for, the overall objective to be reached.
I think I think that's absolutely right. I think the other element of this is when you're involved in big projects, there is usually a governance built around them. Now this doesn't necessarily relate to projects. It can relate to anything in terms of the accountability piece.
Right.
But we do need to create an environment where people feel safe. Too many project meetings I've been involved in, people turn up and give the report and everybody assumes everything's fine because they don't feel safe to report the fact they're either behind, off track, or completely missing the point. Right. And if you don't have that ownership, that safety, then whilst I know I own it, and I might actually realize there is going to be a consequence to my failings later on, but we could deal with things a whole lot sooner. We could deal with things a whole lot quicker. We could mobilize resources or, funding or systems, whatever it's required, if only we knew. And that's, that lack of safety, because we feel this obligation. Accountability comes with, I automatically assume, I used to assume that if I didn't hit my responsibility, I was going to get fired. So if I believe that, I am likely to colour my report in a particular way that frames it in a positive light rather than the brutal facts of the matter.
And a positive element to that possible mistake is that actually, if we can be in that very safe space, that we can be fully accountable in the way that we give bad news as well as good news, is that we can change tack if we need to, and we can change tack in time. We can reverse a decision or change a decision because we're now more aware of information. That if this didn't happen, we'd just continue with the good news message until it was found out.
So in essence, you're saying that actually we need an environment where issues are raised early and safely, and people aren't scared of talking about small problems.
Totally.
Because then they don't become big problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, but they might be a big problem in terms of the consequence if we fail to deal with it. But actually, by raising it early, gives us more time to find a solution, or to alter the plan, as Rob described. I think the other element here is that I think you alluded to this earlier, Paul, which is around we make the mistake of who is accountable and who is responsible. We also make the mistake that actually just because I think you're accountable for it, do you?
Well, and without wanting to diss whoever put the RACI chart together way back when, and I don't know who that was, it has Eric, yeah, it has to be the other way around, because how many project teams are, if you like, confused by the fact that RACI, if they follow it in that way, just causes you to not work on accountability in the right way. So, it needs to be reversed just to help people to know that accountable comes first, then responsible comes second. And then there's a different definition for both of those.
Yeah, and I always like to sort of think of it in the terms of, there can only be one person accountable for every individual bit. That doesn't mean one person's accountable for the whole project.
Right.
I used to work in your own sales teams, and you go, I'm not saying you're accountable for everything, but if these are your customers, you are accountable for them.
Yes.
No one else. Nobody in your team, nobody in another team. It's you. Now, that doesn't mean you'll do it like Ricky said before. It doesn't mean you're going to do all the work. There could be multiple people responsible for delivering against that. Yeah. But one person has to be accountable. And if more than one person's accountable, it's kind of like no one is, because everybody assumes the other person's got it covered when they haven't.
So that leads to another possible mistake, seeing as we're still on that subject, where when this is not clear, when there is some ambiguity, then people who shouldn't be part of the decision-making process sometimes are part of the decision-making process. And allowing that to happen is a really confusing state of affairs and causes, from a leadership point of view, all sorts of lack of clarity, lack of focus, people, cross-working or duplicating effort, because we've allowed as a mistake people to be involved or become part of the decision-making process who shouldn't have been.
Yeah, I always think back to Agile in this, and there's a joke that often gets told in Agile workshops about the pig and the chicken opening a restaurant, and the chicken decides that they should call it ham and eggs, and the pig gets very upset because the pig says, "Yeah, again, I'm committed, and you're involved." and the idea behind that is to go, actually, the decision making process should be around the people who are actually taking accountability. People who are, have skin in the game, and not people who've got an opinion.
Yeah,
they're welcome to contribute, but they're not part of the group.
Yeah, no, I love that.
Anything else that's typically that leaders have before we can get some good tips from you guys of how to do it right?
Well, I guess there's one about allowing the minority to hold up decisions when actually, again, they're not really involved; they're on the sidelines, but they have an agenda. So, they've got some skin in the game because it has an impact on them, or because they've got, some sort of, warped sense of what their responsibility in this is. And actually, they get involved in the decision-making process or hold up the decision-making process because they think that they're protecting their own position or protecting the position of their team. So, that can be a mistake that occurs from time to time as well.
Okay, so give me some tips. How do I get this right? What is it I need to do? Where will I start?
Well, for me, job one is make sure, if you care about something, make sure it has an owner. So who is going to take the accountability for making sure this gets done. No ambiguity, no, total clarity. We all know that Paul or me or you, Rob, are accountable for this particular part.
Yeah. I mean, this is not the most constructive thing I've ever heard, but one of my old bosses used to say, anything that's important needs to have somebody worrying about it.
Nice.
That's probably better put than I just did.
So having an owner for everything. Another tip would be recognize that ownership can only be, and this might be slightly controversial, can only be accepted or taken, not given. So we can't just dole out ownership to people. They have to be in a position to accept it, to take that ownership. So that sort of calls upon leaders to actually test or create a need to test that they understand what people are accountable for.
I totally agree, Robert. I think this is absolutely removing ambiguity. Mm-hmm. I know what the accountability for this looks like.
Right.
So I might have had that responsibility. It might come with the territory because of the nature of the job I do. A project manager, it's really hard to argue that you're not accountable for a project that you're looking after. But what does that mean? Why is this important? And what are the consequences if we fail to deliver on time, in budget, at the right quality, or whatever that might mean?
It's almost like if you're going to accept accountability for something, you sort of you have that goal defined in your moniker in your head, SMART, where you sort of go, right, what specifically am I going to own? What's the measure of that output or that deliverable? So that if I'm asking those questions, it makes it clear for me what goes with the territory. I'm owning this bit of it, and I'm completely comfortable with what that means to me.
And that reminds me of something we see all the time when we're facilitating or coaching, when people go, oh, so-and-so's doing that. Mm. And your first question is, well, have you asked them? Have they agreed? Have you got the level of buy-in, or are you just writing their name because they're not in the room? And so I think this is almost wider than just leaders. It's if you need somebody to do something and that thing is important enough for you to, get it done, you need a level of commitment back from them that they've got it,
yes,
or they haven't got it.
Okay, so you may need to help a person who's going to be accountable to understand what that means. So there are some things here that might fall under the category of risks or consequences or implications of what that means. So taking it on, this is your reason for taking it on, and this is the positive part of that, the towards motivation, if you like, for doing it. But actually not stepping up to it or not taking full accountability for it, there is a consequence or implication of that as well. And so again, back to Ricky's oft used word here about ambiguity, got to be really clear about that so that people understand what it means.
And I think the kind of final tip that springs to mind for me is you can't have shared accountability. One person needs to be accountable. If you care about it, that is, because whether you've got nobody responsible or accountable, it ain't going to happen. And if you've got more than one person, all of a sudden you've built in excuses and you've built in a level of assumption around, well, I thought you got that and I thought you got that. Make sure one person is accountable if you care about it. If you don't care about it, it don't matter, does it? But if you care about it, one person is accountable.
I think that's a brilliant point to leave it. Thank you, guys.
The question is from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Paul from Thinking Focus, and I'm just tagging on the end of this podcast to let you know where you can find more about the leadership model we've been talking about today. If you'd like to know more, maybe see the model in its entirety, or download some free coaching resources to help you think about your leadership style, and then go to www.thinkingfocus.com/what-is-leadership. That's thinkingfocus, all one word, .com/what-is-leadership.
To find out how Thinking Focus can unlock the potential within your organisation, go to www.thinkingfocus.com, where you'll discover more about the work we do, helping our clients increase productivity and enable change.